Good evening. Thank you for attending the Malpractice and Maladministration webinar. Just a couple of little things. First of all, unlike most courses, we don't have to worry too much about the health and safety. But as I'm in my office today, if you hear a fire alarm go off, you might find there's going to be a big pause after it, which means I've exited the building. But let's hope that won't happen. Okay, let's move on. Right, first of all, you should find on your screen a small okay, somebody's just mentioned that I hadn't shown my screen. Anyway, this is the second screen. The first one just had the title up. Anyway, just a couple of things. You can ask questions as we go along, and they come up on our my panel here. The chances are I'll answer them at different points. The way to ask a question is that there should be a box on your screen either called message or question. Just type it in there and it will come up on my screen every now and again. This is being recorded so that if you wish to watch again at a later time, then it's available to do that as well. And likewise, there's quite a few people that asked to see the recording at the end of it. First of all, that's me, David Arnold. I'm Chairman of the Association of First Aiders, and I'm also Director and Responsible Officer of AoFAQ qualifications. What Responsible Officer means is actually there's a legal term for it, is that when Ofqual contact me, whatever I say actually represents the whole organisation. So that's what Responsible Officer means. And just below there, obviously says that AoFAQ qualifications is an Ofqual recognised awarding organisation. So what will we be covering today? We'll be covering quite a few different areas, and there's a list there. So what is malpractice, maladministration? These are two areas that a lot of people get confused over. What action do we take when malpractice is identified? And also the various things that we need to look at, timescales. And we also, of course, for any malpractice activity, we have procedures that we must follow. So let's move on that one. Oh, just looking at my notes here, just before we go, you might not be a centre of us as an awarding organisation, but if you're with a different organisation, awarding organisation, then this is still applicable to you, as all awarding organisations have to comply with Ofqual's conditions of recognition. So you will, or they will, as an awarding organisation, have something very similar to this. First of all, what is malpractice? Ofqual actually don't give a real definition for it, but malpractice, as it says, maladministration, as it says there, is essentially an activity or practice that results in non-compliance with administrative regulations and requirements. So it's quite a wide and broad term. It can be generally just mistakes, it can be poor administration, it can be several things that can be classified as maladministration. I quite like the three monkeys there. I think that's quite applicable to maladministration as well as malpractice. Right, what is maladministration? Okay, just a few examples here, and we'll work through a few more. The first one is administrative errors. This is a fairly common one we find, and that's where a member of staff does something wrong, maybe inconsistency in marking papers, misplacing paperwork, so that's your filing system there, and consistently fails, say, to organise the exam papers correctly. Delaying information to FAQ of any of these changes can also be considered that. So basically what it is, it's an administration thing. And yes, we all do faults, we all have faults. And as long as it's just a fault and not anything too serious, then it can be just considered as maladministration. The failure, the other thing that we could look at is mainly things like the failure to conduct as a trainer. So if you're a trainer, It could be things that you're not properly registered with us, and that may be looked at as maladministration, that you haven't got the paperwork correctly into us. It could be as simple as things like the trainer fails to carry out ID checks before delivering the training of the course. One of the requirements for trainers is that we need to make sure that the learners on your course are actually who they say they are. It can be an unintentional breach of copyright, something like misleading learners by mistake and failing to conduct the training course within the number of learning hours stipulated. I also fall into things like marketing mistakes. This is quite a common one that in the early days when a centre first starts, we do monitor them to make sure that the information they put up on their website is representative of what they do. A typical one here can be a centre saying that they're actually Ofqual approved. Centres are never Ofqual approved. They're actually approved by an awarding organisation. And it's the awarding organisation that's actually regulated by Ofqual and not directly to the centre. Neglecting to provide information, this is another thing. Also things like maybe reasonable adjustments are not done correctly and not notifying us in the correct time or manner. Failing to register staff correctly, that could also be one. So there's quite a wide range of things that can happen. Okay, we need a bit of feedback from you now. So this is going to be a poll that's going to appear magically in a second. If I can press the right button, so bear with me 1 second. Okay, so here's a poll. So what happens if so it's a poll. What if I deliver training without exam papers? So can you just click on one, see what happens, see what you would do in that case. So you're doing training, but you haven't received the exam papers. I can see actually from my screen, which you won't be seeing at the moment, that's quite good. And there's basically 3 answers that people are selecting here. Just give it another couple of seconds to allow the scores to stabilize a little bit. Okay, just shut the poll and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so there's the actual answers that come up with on there. So 40% would ask learners questions to meet the learning outcomes. 27% would tell the awarding organisation that they've got no papers, and 59% would delay the exam until papers received. Really, the second answer, tell AoFA, or the last one, which is pretty well should be considered the same altogether, is the right answer. You shouldn't really go and generate your own questions, because questions are actually quite difficult to generate. It does take us a lot of time to do a multi-choice question, but hopefully you would explain to your cohort that the exam papers are not there and they would need to take them at a later time. I know that's not the best thing to do, but there are times when exam papers don't arrive with the trainer due to the fact that they could be lost in the post or they haven't been printed correctly. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we've just touched on a little bit about maladministration. So the maladministration was also do with if you accidentally do something wrong. It's not a deliberate act. And this is where malpractice is different. It's different in respect that it's more of a deliberate thing. So if you look at the definition, malpractice is an activity which deliberately contravenes regulations comprising compromises the integrity of the assessment and undermines the validity of certificates, as in the qualification. It covers deliberate acts, and this can also be from extending maladministration. So just give you an example. If your paperwork is really bad, that could be considered maladministration initially, but if it gets totally out of hand, then that would move into malpractice. So they do overlap quite considerably. But malpractice tends to be more of a deliberate act, so it could be forging certificates, claiming for certificates that haven't been actually done. So let me just move on a little bit more, and then we can give you some more examples. Okay. Here's a few examples that are quite interesting, I think. We have a contract with our centres that when we need information, then they must give us that information. If you don't give us the information, then that would be malpractice. Now, fully appreciate that there are data protection issues, but these are overcome because of the contract between us and you and the learner. Other ones can be deliberately misleading the public with marketing materials. So just give you an example. If you're, say, doing an FAW qualification, and that's a regulated qualification, and then you add it, say, with another qualification that's unregulated, maybe train the trainer, then it could be a point here that your actual learner may believe that the train the trainer qualifications is actually regulated when it's not. So it's important that we do not mislead the public, and in particular the learners. There are obvious things like forgery and fraud, so maybe you forge exam papers, change marks, etc. to enable passes. It's also quite important that you uphold the standards agreed by the centre. So we have a manual which you should have called D13, and that explains in detail how we act together and what your responsibilities are, and we expect you to meet those. So if maladministration is extensive, or left uncorrected, so in other words, maybe an EQA, an external quality assurance person's come in and asked you to correct certain things and you have not done that, that maladministration could quite readily go into malpractice. Obviously, there are things like plagiarism, which could be between learners and other learners, but also could be learners and staff. You've also got things to do with claiming funding. So if you look at the Skills Funding Agency, immediately when money comes into it and you're getting grants, then that's an area which is open to malpractice, and it seems to be a reasonably common one in some, but luckily enough, few organizations. Also, it could be things like not controlling exam papers correctly. Exam papers are very important to us because they uphold the integrity of the qualification. If they're accidentally leaked out or deliberately leaked out, say on the internet, then that would effectively cause problems with the validity of any qualification. Other areas can be things like conflict of interest is not managed correctly. In a later webinar, we're going to have a look at conflict of interest, which is quite important for centres, because a lot of times conflict of interest actually arises, but you may not be fully aware of them. So if it's not managed correctly, then that could be considered malpractice. Okay, we're just going to do another poll now online, just to get some idea. In fact, we've got two coming up now. Bear with me 1 second. So the first one is going to be what if a certificate is issued to a learner who has failed. Okay. What do we do? So if you'd like to click away and see what happens. Just give you a few more seconds to vote. I'm glad to see at the moment nobody's chosen blame someone else. So that's good. Okay, I'm just going to stop that now and let's see what the results are. Okay, that's good really, because if you look at it, 88%, so call the AoFAQ office and ask for further guidance on that one, which is a good idea. Here's the next one come up. And so if this has happened, is this malpractice or maladministration? So let's have a look at the second one. I'm just going to hide that one and select a new one. There we go. If you'd like to answer that, let's see where we go from there. Okay, we're nearly there. And a lot of people are looking at the maladministration side. Okay, let's just close that now. And I'll show you the results. There we go. So most of you decided it was maladministration. A few of you decided it was both. And to be honest, the actual answer is really looking at why that actually happened. So people that selected maladministration or malpractice would be correct. In fact, the only one that would be wrong and nobody selected that would be neither. So it's according to what happens behind the scenes and why that's arrived. The reason I thought we'd just discuss this a little bit, because this has happened in the past. On multi-choice papers, MCQ papers, one of the things we ask is that the trainer obviously gives these out for first aid, because the first aid trainer for first aid courses tend to also do the assessment and issuing the MCQ papers to the learners. At the end of that, the trainer tends to add up all the marks, and then it indicates if there are any areas that needs a little bit more practice and re-instruction and then reassessment. When we have new centres, we asked our centres to send in all of these papers so that we can actually check them to make sure they've been added up correctly and everything's signed off and that sort of thing. We have in certain cases noticed that the actual adding up of the correct answers has been incorrect. This can be a real problem, especially if adding up makes a difference between pass and fail. So obviously if you failed them and the addition has pushed them into pass, that's probably good news for the learner. But if it's the other way around, we actually have to revoke that certificate or do something to overcome that problem. Maybe we could do some more re-instruction and get them to come in and reassessed. But in general, that certificate would need to be revoked. And that's embarrassing for everybody concerned. So what we do actually on our MCQ papers, before they can have direct claims or before they can claim on our online system, we do ask that somebody else actually gives the papers a quick check to make sure some really basic things like adding up is correct and that they've been correctly signed. Okay, let's just move on from that. Sorry, just bear with me a second. Okay, actions to take when malpractice is identified. Okay, so a lot of times we won't, as an awarding organisation, detect malpractice unless we actually come in and see you and we're carrying out an EQA activity. So who informs us? It can be actually pretty well anybody from trainers, centres, IQA, which is an important one, because don't forget your internal quality assurer, their responsibility is also to check your procedures and that you're following your procedures correctly. If they detect something, then they would obviously notify the management of the training centre. But at the same time, if they actually notice or suspect malpractice, they also need to, oh, sorry, somebody just pointed out that the slides are not changing. Let's see if I can get back a bit. Sorry about this. I'm just going to step back a few times on the slides just to show you where we came to. Okay, so it wasn't too far, it was just the next slide. So sorry about that. So nothing too exciting, but that's it. So as I mentioned, who informs us, trainers, centres? The IQA has this responsibility to both the centre and the awarding organisation. EQA obviously is looking out for potential malpractice and also maladministration. An interesting one that you might not expect is actually the learner. If, for example, you're forging certificates and you're saying to the learner, well, don't worry, if you give us some money, you can pass, then that learner may not be happy with that situation. Okay, they've ended up with a certificate, but they're probably feeling done by that. They haven't done the training and they can't feel actually that they warrant that award. Other areas that we check is actually social media. Social media is becoming quite prominent because a lot of people will complain more likely on social media than they will actually directly to the centre. So we keep an eye out on social media, and so do our EQAs, and they notify us if there's any potential problem that may be coming. Finally, of course, Ofqual might contact us and ask us to investigate a malpractice issue. Okay, so malpractice has been identified. So what do we do? When I say identified, potential malpractice is identified. According to where the source is, we will actually notify the centre head. We need to inform the regulators and also alert other awarding organisations that may be affected. Two things there to note. Yes, we inform the regulators. They asked us to do that. This is particularly important if there is a chance that the certificates or awards that have been issued need to be revoked. Also, we would need to warn in advance other awarding organisations if we believe that malpractice could likewise impact the integrity of a qualification. So those 2 and 3 conditions are very important. And don't forget, at this point in time, we're only aware of potential malpractice. So if that malpractice potentially could be severe, we will be notifying both those or all 3 of those areas. Right, our responsibility. We actually have to carry out our malpractice activities, and anything that comes in will initially be passed to our compliance department. Our procedures would then acknowledge receipt within 5 working days. This is all typical, and sometimes it's dependent on how much investigation we need to do before we can do that. But in general, we aim at notifying people in 5 working days. The compliance administrator will investigate, allocate a relevant member of staff to lead that investigation. Again, this is all defined within our quality assurance manual with you, which is the D13, so that will give you more things. But what we're trying to do here is follow our set procedures. So whether it is a minor case of malpractice or a case of malpractice that could really impact a number of learners, we still follow set procedures. One thing we have found in the past is where a learner has complained and they complain directly to us. What we would typically do here is that we would listen in brief to the complaint and then decide whether it is potential malpractice or just a complaint about the centre. I don't mean just, but aimed more at the centre. If it's aimed at the centre, then we will not do anything with that apart from note it in our issues log, but we will ask the trainee or the learner to actually make their complaint in writing or verbally initially to the centre. Only if you don't get sufficient attention would you normally come to us, but it will typically be a secondary issue. So first exhaust all routes through the centre and then come to us. So let's go on from that. So we're starting to investigate the malpractice, and we've now allocated the responsibility. So when we're looking at an allegation, we need to gain as much knowledge as we possibly can. So obviously about the centre's details, learners' names, registration numbers, etc. Who was involved? Who was involved is quite important because we may have to be careful of who we actually discuss this with within the centre. If you're a very large organisation or a college, etc., then it's quite normal that we would talk to the management on there. One other thing that I mentioned earlier on is one of our points of contact is always the IQA. So the IQA is an important part of this investigation to help us find the information. Of course, if the IQA is suspected, then that would be different. So details of any causes that are affected, nature of the malpractice and date, and any other relevant information. So that could be obviously other people involved in mitigating circumstances, etc. So what do we do? So we've got this information now, and we're now going to pass it on to how we investigate. This is sort of a general overview of what the investigation is, but it needs to be fair, reasonable, legal manner where possible. I say where possible. We obviously err on the legal side because we are not legal specialists ourselves. If this looks like there's a fraud involved, say for example you're claiming funding, then it is quite likely that we would get other parties involved, including the police, at this fairly early stage. So what are we going to do when we're investigating? Obviously, we establish the facts, cause and the scale, evaluate any action, determine remedial action if required. This is quite important because we could be at this point where we think, gosh, this is a really severe and part of malpractice, and it's going to impact the integrity of the qualification and a number of learners. We can at this point immediately step in and restrict the centre's activity. We could even close the approval on that centre, but typically we would limit it to where we found that evidence of malpractice. Identify any adverse patterns. Request further information if required. Typically that's always required. Ensure materials are kept secure. We keep them secure because after all, if this goes to court, then we need to have access to all the paperwork to support our case. We also expect all parties to fully cooperate with this. This is also quite an awkward position because for smaller organisations involved with malpractice, the first thing they want to do is to separate themselves as much as possible from us. So immediately they deregister and then they refuse to talk to us. That in itself is malpractice. Just because you've cancelled the relationship with our centre, you've cancelled centre registration, that does not mean that you've cancelled your legal responsibilities and contractual responsibilities with us. So we do still expect you to fully cooperate with us. That's normally important because whatever investigations we do, we can only use the evidence that we have in front of us. So let's have a look at the timelines here. Stages of investigation, actions resolved within 30 working days. That's what we aim for. There are times when that will be delayed. For example, if we're requesting further information and that information is either incomplete or they're refusing to give that information, then we have to put more pressure on the centre. So we give them slightly more time before we proceed. But we proceed anyway. So even if the centre is not working to assist us with information, we will still proceed with it. Again, we reserve the right to impose sanctions at any point in this investigation, as mentioned previously. Outcomes. If the investigation confirms a malpractice or severe maladministration has taken place, then we impose sanctions. This can be quite limited. It could be maybe purely on a trainer that you won't be able to use anymore, or it may be on a course, or it may be on a qualification, or it may be for the complete centre. We obviously inform the centre, we do a report and that's issued, and we also inform the regulatory authorities, in our case normally Ofqual. We then ask the centre to inform affected learners This again can be very difficult for smaller centres. They will either refuse to do that. But that doesn't stop us revoking the certificates where required. So we actually revoke them on our database, so that when the certificate comes up for checking, then it will flag up on our system that it's a void certificate. We also inform third parties, as mentioned. These would be other awarding organisations, etc. Now, one thing we have to do is we look at the information that's presented to us. We do err on the safe side because, after all, we're looking at qualifications here that could be considered to be licensed to work. So we really look at making sure that the qualifications that we issue are effective and robust and have not been degraded in any way. So we need a high degree of confidence that what we've issued is valid. So we are likely to revoke certificates if we do not have sufficient evidence that they are valid. Sounds a little bit round the wrong way, but take for instance that would you be happy with a first aider attending your child if you weren't certain that they received sufficient and adequate training? So we do look at protecting the learner and protecting the qualification. So part of this draft report, part of the report is draft report. We make the final report available and we inform third parties within 10 days. Bear with me 1 second. Yeah, okay, I was just checking the next slide. I thought I'd missed something. Okay, so that's the normal thing. Now, important part here is the reflection bit. We look at our procedures after we've gone through this and see if the ways we can actually improve it. Also, if we are still talking to the centre, and hopefully we are, then we will also look at ways they can improve the centre, because after all, a lot of malpractice issues are not to do with the actual management or the owners of the organisation. It might be a trainer or assessor that's causing problems. So we look at ways to overcome that, which is very important. Before we actually close this, there is one other stage, and that's the appeals. So as part of our final activity, we actually send the report to the centre, and the centre has 15 days to appeal the report. So what tends to happen is that the centre says, I'm appealing, full stop, that's it. We can't do anything at that stage if they just say they're appealing. They need to have legitimate grounds for that appeal. So why are they appealing? So it's no good just saying, no, we don't think it's correct. You've got to give us grounds for that. And also supporting evidence or information. Both of those are very important. We need a reason to go through the appeal. Now, if the appeal is not upheld, it can still be escalated by the centre to the AoFAQ board to review, and it can even go higher than that. And if necessary, we can appoint an independent reviewer. But note that this last stage normally incurs a charge for it because we've really exhausted all of our routes. We're fairly confident, or we are confident at this stage, that the malpractice was valid. So if you want to go to the final stage, then there is a charge, and that charge is levied in advance. However, if the appeal is upheld, then we do refund that. Now, we do have a whistleblowing policy, and that keeps the person's information confidential. We do, where possible, ask them to tell us all the information, etc., about who they are, but we can also keep that confidential to our officers as well. And the only terms that would be overturned would be by the courts. So we do recommend that you tell us all the information possible and let us have your information, contact details, etc. And we will keep that confidential, and we will certainly keep it confidential from the report so that the centre would not know who you are. But obviously, if you can give us details, then we can take more notice of you, and we can also contact you again for further information. So that's very important. Of course, we're blaming everybody else at the moment, but of course, what happens if it's one of our staff members that's you're not happy with and they're suspected of malpractice or maladministration? That's quite important in what happens here. is that it's investigated by other people within the company, and it normally would also go to the board of directors, the governing board and the board of directors, for assistance there. So we need to make sure that what we do is independent of the person or staff member in question. But I will say at this point in time, we've been lucky that this hasn't been tested, thank goodness. Right, so we've just about come to the end of it. We expected this to last about 45 minutes, but before you go, please ask any questions that you might have, and there's a box on your screen on the left-hand side that we can see, and hopefully I can go through some of the questions and help you there. Okay, so I'm just going to do the last slide, but it's not that saying that I'm disappearing just yet. Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions that you've posed. Okay. Right, if a company requests a copy of your teaching qualifications, are they breaching any laws? If you're just after a copy of the qualifications, then no, because that's public knowledge, and that can be downloaded from our website. And also, what people don't realize is that most of the information about the qualification can be found either in the qualification specification, which we publish, or just by going on Ofqual database. There you'll get a list of the learning outcomes and, more importantly, the assessment criteria. So that really gives you a very good hint about how it's going to be assessed. And we also specify if it's going to be MCQs, multiple choice questions or observations, etc. So hopefully that's helped out there. Right, okay. Okay, bear with me 1 second. Keep going. Somebody's giving me indications to slide down a bit on the screen I've got here. This one. Okay, will there be a sample policy sent to us and a script of this session? First answer is no. However, you will be sent a link to this so you can view it again. Now, if you're one of our centres, or in fact, if you're a centre of any awarding organisation, you should have a contract and a manual that says your relationship with the awarding organisation. So have a look in there, and there will be procedures on how this is all run. Let's have a look, see what else we've got here. Got lots of questions, so I'm just trying to filter some of them out. Oh, CPD. Can I credit this as a CPD? I'm sorry, I've got one from Mike Evans here. Asks about will this contribute towards CPD? Absolutely, yeah. Give yourself some marks for the CPD. List it down on there. It's typically a mark per hour, but I would just give yourself 1 mark CPD for this. Okay, it's a fairly dry subject, as you've probably found out. Right, one of these is, do you have to request question papers for every course? Can we use the same ones? That's a bit of an awkward answer. We do use the same papers repeatedly, but they are redone periodically. And the period is defined by how many awards we actually give under that qualification. So if you look at, for example, the emergency first aid at work, which is probably our #1 qualification, we redo those questions quite regularly. If you go to the other extreme on, say, a level 3 course of, say, health and safety, then we do that less often. The questions are actually done and changed in different ways. We have quite a large question bank, and these are randomly selected. And also the answers or the distractors are actually mixed up as well for each one. So the main thing is that if you just give the centre here, the office here a call, then we will tell you what the latest papers are. They're all numbered. Right, here's one here. If an FAW is completed in 2 days and not 3 due to the amount of attendees, is this malpractice? Actually, it is malpractice. It's a deliberate act. No, there is some very strict requirements. If you're doing an FAW, and this is not the requalification, because the requalification can be done over 2 days if you've got a valid certificate. It must be done in, I think it's 18 hours minimum on that one. If you wanted to run the 18 hours, you could probably do it in a day. I wouldn't like to be a learner on that course, but basically you must do the minimum hours. And I fully appreciate that if you've only got a couple of people on the course, it can be a difficult course to do. But I think that's down to the trainer building up some other materials that you can go through to extend that. But no, there is a minimum time, and we would consider that as a malpractice. And we would at least pull you up on it and tell you to change your procedures. Do AoFAQ send certificates to attendees for CPD records? What we'll do on this one is that we have a list of your email addresses. What we'll do is we'll create a CPD certificate for everybody that's attended, and we'll send it to you. So hopefully that's going to help you. Right, another question here. I have a visit coming up from an EQA. Is there any issues raised about my admin? Would I get advice and support? The external quality assurance, the EQA, is actually there to help you. So first of all, be very open. If you're a new center, we don't expect you to be running perfectly. So they will help you to get in line with our requirements. The main thing they would be looking for is obviously deliberate acts of forgery and malpractice that way. But if it's mainly maladministration, so maybe you're not keeping the correct records at this point in time, then the EQA is there to help. So please be open with the EQA. They are not there to shut you down. They are there to help you. Right, so I'm just seeing if there's any other ones. Somebody missed the first 20 minutes. Yeah, it's being recorded, so that's good. And somebody's answered that for you anyway. Right, I think that's about it. So look, really a big thanks for your time in coming to see this. It's good that you're showing an interest in these important events, which help you keep on the straight and narrow, for lack of a better phrase. We are running one, I think, in about another week's time, which will be on, what's the one on? Oh, thank you. Somebody's just told me conflict of interest, and that's for your benefit here as well. So it's looking at your conflict of interest problems, not ours. So that's going to be very much focused on your activities. So please come and join us then. But once again, thank you very much.